The wind off the wolf's wood carried everything to Jon Snow before it arrived. That was simply how his life worked: scent before sight, sound before shadow, truth before the lie a man had carefully arranged on his face. He smelled King Robert's procession a full hour before the gates of Winterfell opened to receive it. Horse sweat and road dust, the iron tang of 100 knights' armor, perfumed Southron ladies who had never known real winter, and beneath all of it, the sour milk undercurrent of a king who drank more than he ruled. Jon stood on the ramparts above the courtyard in the gray Winterfell morning and knew all of this before a single banner crested the tree line. He pulled his hood lower. He always pulled his hood lower. The ears were the thing people saw first, silver white and wolfish, rising from the dark tumble of his curls within. Animal elegance that had never belonged on a human face, and never would, because Jon Snow was not entirely human. And Winterfell had spent 16 years negotiating that reality in careful silence. The claws came second in people's notice, curved and dark at the tips of his fingers. Not monstrous, but unmistakable. The kind of detail that made septons reach for their holy texts and lords reach for their swords. He kept them trimmed as short as they would go. It never made much difference. Ned Stark had told him the truth when Jon was old enough to hold it, that the old gods had made him different, that the weirwood had wept red the night he was born, that whatever soul lived inside, Jon Snow had lived a long time before and carried old power in its bones. His Lord Father had said it with the measured northern gravity he brought to everything, his gray eyes holding Jon's without flinching. You are of my blood in every way that matters. What you are beyond that, the gods made, and I will not apologize for the gods. Jon had loved him for it, had spent every year since trying to be worthy of it, which mostly meant keeping his hood up and his claws out of sight and his demon nature pressed down beneath his sternum, like a banked fire he could not afford to let breathe. Robb didn't care about the years. Arya thought they were the finest things she'd ever seen and spent 3 years periodically trying to touch them when Jon wasn't paying attention. Sansa had learned courtesy well enough to look past them. Bran asked questions with the pure scientific interest of a boy who had not yet learned what the world did to things that were different. Jon loved them all with a fierceness that frightened him. Sometimes the demon's capacity for attachment, Ned had warned him gently, ran deeper than a human heart's, and losing what it loved would not produce grief the way grief was supposed to work. He didn't know then how soon he would understand what his father meant. The royal procession filled the courtyard, below with its noise and its color and its casual southern arrogance. Jon watched from the ramparts as Ned led his family down to kneel, watched Robert Baratheon climb from his horse with the effort of a man whose body had long since outrun his legend, watched the Queen's cold eyes move across the assembled Starks with the systematic efficiency of a woman calculating costs. And then Cersei Lannister's gaze traveled up the walls, performing its inventory of Winterfell's strength, and landed on Jon. He watched her eyes stop. He watched her take in the years, the claws resting on the stone parapet, the stillness of something that was not quite a boy looking back at her. He watched the calculation in her face shift into something sharper and uglier. She looked away in 3 seconds, which was 3 seconds longer than most people managed before they remembered they were supposed to pretend they hadn't seen. Jon pulled his hood the rest of the way up and went to find somewhere else to be. He found Tyrion Lannister instead, which he had not expected, and which turned out to be one of the more honest conversations of his life. The imp had separated himself from the procession with the practiced ease of a man long accustomed to not being wanted at the important gatherings, and he was standing in the shadow of the great hall's entrance examining a raven that had landed on a nearby post with the focused interest of a man who found birds more trustworthy than people. You move quietly for someone who could presumably smell me coming, Tyrion said without turning around. I didn't say I moved quietly. I said you didn't hear me. Tyrion turned then, and his mismatched eyes did what most eyes did. Found the ears, found the claws, completed their survey. But where most people then performed either fear or careful ignorance, Tyrion Lannister simply looked interested. Jon Snow, Ned Stark's remarkable bastard. I'd heard the stories, but Westeros north of the neck has a tendency toward mythology. I'd assumed exaggeration. And now I'm revising my assumptions. which is my favorite activity. He tilted his head. Do they function? The ears. Can you actually hear better than a man ought to? I heard your queen decide I was a problem before her horse had stopped moving. Tyrion was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with a precision that contained a genuine warning inside its wit, that is both impressive and deeply unfortunate. Cersei has a particular relationship with things she identifies as problems. He paused. I'd suggest the wall, but I suspect you've already considered it. Jon had considered it for 3 years. The Night's Watch asked no questions about what a man was. It only asked what he could do. He didn't know yet that the answer to that question would change everything. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. All men must die, but legends endure. Cersei Lannister did not make decisions the way other people made decisions. Other people gathered information, weighed options, consulted advisors, and arrived at conclusions through a process that at least resembled deliberation. Cersei identified threats and then worked backward through every available method of neutralizing them until she found the one that cost her the least and hurt the target the most. She had completed this process regarding Jon Snow before the welcoming feasts. First course had been cleared. From the tables, she watched him from across the great hall with the patience of a woman who had spent 20 years learning to hide her intelligence behind her beauty, and what she saw made the patience difficult to maintain. He sat at the lower tables with the household guard and the older servants. Ned Stark's careful political positioning of his bastard, keeping him present enough to honor but distant enough not to provoke. And even there, even with his hood drawn and his hands kept below the table's edge, he was wrong in a way that made her skin prickle. The knights nearest him sat with a particular quality of alertness, the unconscious animal awareness of men in proximity to something their instincts recognized as apex. They were not afraid of him. They were aware of him the way prey is aware of weather. Cersei refilled her wine and looked at her husband. Robert was laughing at something Lord Stark had said, his great hand slamming the table with the enthusiasm of a man who had not been genuinely happy in 15 years but could still perform happiness well enough to fill a room with it. He had not noticed Jon Snow at all. Robert noticed things that presented themselves for his notice: women, enemies, the next cup, and a hooded boy at a lower table did not present itself. This was the gap between them that had always mattered most. She leaned toward Joffrey, who was watching the lower tables with the bright-eyed, acquisitive attention he brought to anything he didn't yet own. You see Stark's bastard, she said quietly. The one with the— Joffrey touched his own head. Don't point. Her voice was silk over stone. He can hear you. That's the first thing you must understand about him. He can hear everything in this room. She let that settle. The second thing is that he is a problem that your grandfather will need to be told about. Joffrey's expression shifted into the particular calculation that was the most Lannister thing about him, the one feature that might have made him survivable if it had been paired with anything resembling patience or wisdom. What kind of problem? The kind that doesn't stay in the north, she said, and returned her attention to her wine. Across the hall, Jon's ear, the right one, which tracked threat sound instinctively, tilted 1 degree toward the queen's table. He had heard every word. His claws pressed into his thigh beneath the table, the points just sharp enough against the fabric to give him something to focus on. That wasn't the red that wanted to bleed into his vision. When he felt hunted, he was very practiced at feeling hunted and doing nothing about it. Tyrion materialized at his elbow sometime between the second and third course, which Jon had smelled coming. Lannister wine and genuine curiosity, a combination he was already learning to recognize as the imp's personal signature. The small man settled onto the bench beside him with the comfortable ease of someone who had long ago made peace with the fact that he would always be in the wrong seat at the wrong table. My sister, Tyrion said conversationally, pouring himself wine from Jon's flagon without asking, has dispatched a raven. Jon looked at him. Technically, she dispatched it this afternoon, before the feast. She's efficient that way. Tyrion examined his cup. It went to Casterly Rock. I can't read the contents because I'm not supposed to know it exists. But I know my sister's ravens the way a man knows his enemy's battle rhythm. It was a short message. Short messages to my father are either reassurances or requests for action. He paused. She was not reassured by your arrival. I've been here my whole life. Yes, but she hadn't seen you. Before. Tyrion looked at him with the directness that was either his greatest quality or his most dangerous one, depending on who you asked. You should understand what she sees. She sees something she cannot explain, connected by blood to the most powerful lord in the north, with capabilities she cannot quantify and therefore cannot account for. Cersei's relationship with the unquantifiable is not comfortable, and Tywin Lannister's relationship with it considerably worse. Tyrion drank. My father believes that all power is ultimately a resource to be controlled, or a threat to be eliminated. He doesn't have a third category. You are going to force him to invent one, and he will not enjoy the experience. Jon was quiet for a moment. The feast noise rolled around them. Laughter, music, the clatter of a kingdom's court pretending that everything was as it had always been, that a king's health was not failing and a throne's foundation was not beginning to crack. He could smell the wine sweat of men drinking to avoid thinking. He could hear, 3 tables away, 2 knights whispering about whether Stark's demon bastard would accompany the king's party south. He turned to Tyrion. What do you see? The imp considered this with what appeared to be genuine seriousness. Someone who has spent their entire life making themselves smaller than they are, he said finally, which is something I recognize. He set down his cup. The wall will take you, if that's the direction you're thinking. The Night's Watch asks nothing about a man's nature. But Jon, whatever you're carrying in that hooded silence of yours, the wall has a way of eventually calling it out. He glanced north, through the stone, in the direction of something he could not see, but had clearly spent time thinking about. There are things beyond it that will not care how quiet you've learned to be. Littlefinger had been watching from the high table throughout this conversation, with the expression of a man who had just discovered an asset he hadn't known to look for and was already designing the ledger entry. Castle Black smelled like cold stone, burning pitch, unwashed men, and the particular bitter iron scent of a brotherhood that had long ago made peace with dying unremembered. Jon noticed all of it within 30 seconds of passing through the gate, cataloged it the way he cataloged everything, involuntarily and completely. The demon senses doing their constant work regardless of whether he wanted them to. He noticed, too, the moment every man in the yard became aware of him, not the cautious social awareness of Winterfell's household, who had spent years learning to normalize what Jon was. This was rawer, fresher. The Watch's recruits were drawn from the dungeons, and the gutters, and the lost corners of Westeros. Men who had survived by reading threat correctly, and something in the collective animal base of them registered Jon Snow's arrival and took a long, uncertain moment to file it. Tyrion had ridden with them as far as the wall. He had spent the journey dispensing observations about the Night's Watch with the affectionate contempt of a man who genuinely respected an institution he found completely absurd. They take the dregs of the realm, dress them in black, and ask them to hold the edge of the known world with a budget that wouldn't cover my wine cellar for a fortnight. It is either the most noble or the most tragic arrangement in Westerosi history, and I have not yet decided which. Samwell Tarly had decided it was tragic approximately 4 hours after arriving. Jon found him on the first night, sitting behind the armory in the particular posture of a person trying to occupy as little space as possible, while the world demonstrated its intentions toward them. 3 recruits had already made their feelings about Sam's presence known in the physical vocabulary that men without education default to when they want to establish hierarchy. Sam had a split lip and the expression of someone who had accepted that this was simply what his life was now. Jon sat beside him without ceremony. Sam looked up, took in the ears, the claws, the general reality of Jon Snow, and went through the standard sequence: surprise, adjustment, decision, faster than most people managed. Perhaps because a boy with a split lip in a yard full of hostile men was already operating with recalibrated expectations of what normal looked like. "You're Ned Stark's son," he said. "His bastard. Jon Snow." Sam nodded as if this confirmed something. "I'm Sam. Samwell Tarly. My father sent me here because I didn't want to be a soldier, which is, well, here I am. Here you are." They sat in the cold for a while. John could hear the three recruits who had hit Sam earlier, around the far side of the armory, recalibrating their next move in the low-voiced shorthand of men deciding whether a thing was worth the risk. He tracked them with his right ear and waited. "Can you actually hear through walls?" Sam asked. "Stone muffles it." "Not much." "That's remarkable." Sam said it with genuine scholarly wonder, as if John's nature were an interesting problem rather than a social liability. And something in John's chest moved, slightly in a direction it didn't usually move. "I've read about half-demons in the older texts. There are references in the preandal histories, before the faith suppressed most of the demonology manuscripts. The Citadel has 3 scrolls in the restricted archive that discuss." He stopped. "Sorry, I tend to talk about things I've read when I'm nervous." "Don't stop." Sam blinked. "The restricted archive," John said. "What do the scrolls say?" What followed was the most information John had ever received about his own nature, from any source that wasn't his father's careful, loving inadequacy on the subject. Sam talked for an hour about the preundal records of what the old text called half-blooded spirit warriors, about the Weirwoods' historically documented capacity for what the Maesters euphemistically termed soul-threading, about 3 separate accounts of individuals born with supernatural senses and physical attributes that matched no human genealogy. The Maesters had classified all of it as mythology. Sam, with the quiet intellectual rebellion of someone who had read too carefully to accept the Citadel's editorial decisions, had his doubts. Lord Commander Mormont found John the following morning. The old bear moved through Castle Black with the weighted deliberateness of a man who had commanded the wall long enough to know that it would outlast him and had made his peace with that. He looked at John the way experienced soldiers looked at unusual terrain, not with fear, not with wonder, with professional assessment. He had clearly been briefed. He was clearly not going to pretend the briefing hadn't happened. "Ned Stark's bastard," he said. "My Lord Commander, I knew your father 20 years. Mormont clasped his hands behind his back and looked at the wall rising beyond the yard, its ancient ice catching the morning light like a slab of clouded sky hammered vertical. "He wrote me when you were born. Didn't explain everything. Explained enough." He was quiet for a moment. "The watch takes men as they are. Whatever you are, that falls inside men far as I'm concerned. What it doesn't fall inside is what I can afford to waste on yard duty and latrine assignment." John waited. "Your senses," Mormont said. "You can smell what's coming before it arrives. Hear through a ranging party's perimeter. Tracked by scent in a wideout." He turned from the wall to look at John directly. "Do you have any idea what that's worth beyond that ice?" John thought about the stories Ben Jen had told him, about what the Rangers came back describing when they came back at all, about what they stopped being able to describe after a certain point, because the cold had taken their tongues along with everything else. "I have some idea," he said. "Then you'll lead your first, ranging within the month." Mormont turned back toward his tower. "Keep the claws away from the other recruits unless it's necessary. The watch has enough theology arguments without adding demonology to the list." Behind the armory, John's right ear tracked the 3 recruits rounding the corner toward Sam's position again. He stood up. It turned out to be necessary almost immediately. The Raven arrived at Castle Black on a morning when the wall was groaning. It did that sometimes, a sound like the world's oldest wound shifting in its sleep, deep and resonant and coming from everywhere at once. The ice settling under its own impossible weight. Most of the brothers had long since stopped hearing it. John heard it always, a constant bass note beneath everything. The wall speaking in a frequency that his demon blood translated into something that felt uncomfortably like warning. He was on the training yards, eastern edge working, through sword forms with long claw, when Ghost pressed against his leg and went still. And Ghost going still was a language John had learned to read before he learned to read words. He stopped. He heard the raven's wings before it cleared the wall's shadow, heard the maester's door, heard the shuffle of parchment, heard the particular silence that fell over a room when the words on a page were bad enough to stop a man's breath. He could not hear the words themselves through that much stone, but he heard Maester Eamon make a sound that old men make when something they feared for a long time has finally arrived, a sound that was less grief and more grim confirmation. and John's claws closed around. Longclaw's hilt until the leather wrapping creaked. He knew before anyone came to tell him. He knew the way he knew weather. And threat and the cold rot smell of something dead that hadn't accepted it yet. He knew it in the demon's capacity for attachment his father had warned him about, that bottomless, not quite human depth of feeling that Inuyasha's blood carried, like a second inheritance alongside the claws and the ears and the windscar potential of a blade swung in genuine fury. He knew it, and he stood in the yard with the wall, groaning above him and Ghost, motionless at his leg, and he held the knowing at arm's length for as long as he could. Samuel found him, because Sam was the kind of person who volunteered for the tasks no one else wanted, including delivering devastating news to half-demons he'd known for 3 weeks. He didn't say it immediately. He stood in the yard with his round face, doing the complicated work of someone trying to find the right arrangement of words for something that didn't have one. And John watched him struggle with it and felt the knowing press closer and said quietly, "Tell me, Lord Stark," Sam said. "Your father. He's in King's Landing," Joffrey ordered. The rest of the sentence didn't matter. John heard the word Joffrey and the word ordered, and the gap between them filled itself in with a completeness that left no room for alternate interpretation. Because he had stood in a courtyard in Winterfell and watched Cersei Lannister's eyes find him and calculate, and he had listened to Tyrion's careful warnings about short ravens to Casterly Rock, and he had spent 16 years understanding that the world did specific things to the people it could not categorize and the people who loved them. The fire that had lived banked beneath his sternum his entire life moved. Not the small controlled warmth he managed daily, the ember he cupped in both hands and carefully kept from oxygen. This was the other thing. The thing beneath the ember. The thing his father had held him by the shoulders at age 9 and looked him in the eye about with an expression of genuine paternal fear. "John, there is something in you that is older than you are and angrier than you know. You must never let it take your eyes. Promise me." And John had promised, because he was 9 and he loved his father, and the gray eyes were asking something real. He had kept the promise for 7 years. His eyes went red, not gradually, not the slow bleed of a man losing his temper. The full demon shift, red bleeding into his irises from the outside in. The world's colors inverting into something sharper and more brutal. The yard's details suddenly hyper-present in the way that things became hyper-present when the demons' survival calculus took the wheel. He heard Sam step back. He heard Ghost make a sound that wasn't quite a growl, the dire wolf pressing closer. Rather than retreating, the animal recognizing something in John's blood that it had always recognized and accepted without condition. John's claws opened at his sides. The yard stone cracked under his feet where he stood, hairline fractures radiating from his boots as the demon's strength bled into the ground through sheer uncontrolled pressure. He was aware of brothers stopping across the yard, aware of the cold air filling his lungs with each breath that was coming faster than it should, aware that the rational Jon Snow, the careful, hooded, claw-filed Jon Snow who had spent his entire life making himself smaller than he was currently located somewhere very far behind his sternum and receding. What remained was grief weaponized by demon blood. What remained was the ancient soul Inuyasha's reincarnation, carried, the half-demon, who had watched people he loved torn from him before, in lives he didn't consciously remember, but that had apparently left their emotional architecture intact. The loss didn't feel new. It felt like something with scar tissue around it that had been torn open, which was worse, because scar tissue doesn't hurt the first time. Mormont's voice cut through the red. Not shouting. The old bear didn't shout. He spoke in the register of a man who had commanded frightened soldiers, and he spoke with absolute calm, which was more effective than volume. With John in the way that stillness is more effective than motion when you're trying to catch something wild. Snow. John's breathing was ragged. Snow. Look at the wall. He looked at the wall. 480 feet of ancient ice, blue-white in the morning light, older than every house and king and schemer below it, older than the grudges and the politics, and the golden-haired boy in King's Landing who had just signed Ned Stark's death warrant, older than grief, even. The red receded, slowly, like tide pulling back from rock. His father was dead. The man who had held his nature without flinching, who had called it God-made, who had said in every way that matters, and meant it with every particle of his northern soul, gone. John stood in the cracked yard with Ghost, pressed against him and the wall groaning. Overhead, and the promise he had, made at 9 years old, lying in pieces around his boots. And he made a different promise to no one and everyone. In the particular silence that comes after something irrevocable. Not yet, but not never. Melisandre of Asshai had looked into her fires for 30 years and seen things that would have broken a lesser woman's theology entirely. She had seen kings rise and crumble to ash. She had seen shadow children born of blood and desire do the work that armies could not. She had seen Stannis Baratheon's future written in flame, with the absolute conviction of a woman whose God had never once given her reason to doubt his literacy. She was not, by any measure, a woman who was easily surprised by what the flames showed her. The night she saw Jon Snow, she knocked over her brazier. It was not a dramatic fall. She caught it before the coals spilled. The instinct of a woman who had tended fires in every climate the known world offered. But the flinch was real, and Melisandre did not flinch. She stood in her chamber aboard the ship rounding eastwatch by the sea, and looked at what the flames had shown her, and looked at it again, and felt something she had not felt since she was a slave girl in Asshai before R'hllor's fire found her. She felt uncertain. The fire had shown her a figure at the wall, black cloaked against castle black stone, wolf ears silver in the moonlight, eyes that carried their own heat in a way that was neither the cold blue of the dead nor the warm amber of R'hllor's chosen, but something older than both, something that her entire theological framework had no column for. The Lord of Light's prophecy spoke of Azor Ahai reborn, a warrior of fire, a prince who was promised, a hero to stand against the darkness. The prophecy did not speak of half-demons. The prophecy did not speak of demon blood woven through a stark bastard by the old god's intervention. The prophecy had not anticipated the old gods collaborating. She arrived at Castle Black on a gray afternoon with a small retinue and the particular quality of absolute self-possession that powerful women in Westeros learned to wear like armor. The gate guards did what gate guards did, registered her red robes, registered her beauty, registered the ruby at her throat, made their calculations. She walked through them with the patience of a woman who had walked through harder obstacles than gate guards. Jon was in the yard. She stopped when she saw him, truly stopped, mid-stride, in a way that her attendants had never seen her do, and looked. He was working with 3 younger brothers on ranging formations, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had discovered that the Night's Watch listened to competence faster than it listened to rank, especially when competence came with ears that could hear an ambush through a tree line. He had his hood down. In the open cold of Castle Black's yard, he had apparently decided that the watch had earned the unobscured reality of what he was, and the brothers around him had apparently decided they agreed, working with him with the comfortable ease of men who had recalibrated their definition of normal and moved on. He smelled her approach. She watched him register it, that slight rightward tilt of the wolf ear, the half-second pause in his instruction, and then he turned, and his dark eyes found her with the directness of someone who was never surprised by arrival, only by content. She looked into his eyes and felt the fire in her chest lean toward him the way flame leans toward oxygen. "You are not what I expected," she said. "People keep saying that." He studied her with the same unadorned attention he apparently gave everything, the demon senses running their assessment. "You're from Dragonstone. You serve Stannis Baratheon. I serve R'hllor. Stannis Baratheon serves R'hllor's purpose." She tilted her head. "You serve something older." His jaw tightened slightly. "I serve the Night's Watch." "Yes," she said, in the tone of someone acknowledging a thing that was true and also beside the point. "May we speak privately?" Mormont gave them the small hall off the commander's tower, which Jon suspected was less about hospitality and more about the old bear wanting to be close enough to intervene if theological discussion became something more structurally damaging. Jon sat across a rough-hewn table from the red woman and watched the ruby at her throat pulse with a light that had no obvious source and waited for her to begin. She began by looking at him for a long time in silence, which most people found unsettling and which John found merely inefficient. The Lord of Light's fire, she said finally, responds to certain souls. Azor Ahai reborn, the prince, who was promised, carries a particular heat in their being that Rulares flame recognizes across any distance. She folded her hands on the table. When I look into my fire and seek the promised warrior, I see flame. Pure, singular, consuming. This is what I have always seen. She paused. When I looked last night, I saw flame, and I saw something looking back at it. John said nothing. Your demon blood, she continued carefully. As if constructing an argument she was still building as she spoke, is not of Rulaler. It is not of the old gods in any form I recognize from existing theology. It is prior, older than the division between fire and ice, older than the long night's first coming, older than the wall itself. If the flames are showing me what I think, they're showing me. Her red eyes held his dark ones, which raises a question my God has not answered, and I find I am unaccustomed to unanswered questions. What's the question? Whether you are the weapon the Lord of Light has been preparing, she said quietly, or the weapon the darkness has been preparing, and whether there is, in the end, any difference between the two. John felt his claws press against his palms beneath the table. My father is dead, he said, executed by the king your lord's chosen serves. I'm aware that Stannis has a better claim than Joffrey. I'm aware that Rulares fires see further than most men's ravens. He leaned forward slightly. Here is what I know about prophecy, Lady Melisandre. My father believed in honor above strategy, in the laws of gods and men above political survival. He died for it on the steps of the September of Baelor while a city watched and a boy king preened. His voice was very even. I have no interest in being anyone's promised warrior. I have interest in what is coming from the north and whether anything alive can stop it. Melisandre was quiet for a long moment. Show me your eyes, she said. The demon's eyes. No, she almost smiled. You are afraid of what I'll see in them. I'm afraid of what I'll do when they're that color, he said. There's a difference. She looked at him for another long moment, and in the ruby's pulsing light something shifted in her expression, the absolute theological certainty cracking just enough to let something more honest through. A woman, beneath the red robes and the ancient conviction. A woman who had seen a great deal and was looking at something that fell outside the map. The night is dark and full of terrors, she said softly. John looked at the wall through the hall's narrow window, at the ancient ice holding back whatever the north was preparing. I know, he said. I can smell them from here. The ranging party left Castle Black before dawn on a morning so cold the torches burned with a tight, windless precision that made them look painted rather than real. John led 6 brothers north, Gren, whose size and loyalty made him the watch's most reliable anchor in a crisis. PYP, whose quick eyes compensated for what he lacked in mass. And 4 veterans whose names John had learned and whose capabilities he had cataloged with the automatic efficiency of demon senses, applied to tactical assessment. Sam had been explicitly forbidden from joining by Mormont, explicitly requested to join by Sam himself, and ultimately included because John had pointed out quietly to the Lord Commander that Sam's knowledge of pre-Undul demonology texts had already proven more operationally useful than 3 of the veterans' combined ranging experience. Mormont had not argued. The old bear had a pragmatist relationship with being right. They crossed through the wall's tunnel in single file, the ancient ice pressing close on all sides with its cold blue luminescence. And John felt the change the moment they cleared the northern gate. He always felt it, the subtle shift in the air's quality beyond the wall, something that had no name in any language he knew but that. His demon blood registered as a frequency change, the world's background radiation, altering in a way that made the hair on his arms rise beneath his cloak, as if the rules that governed the southern reality attenuated here, thinned like ice over deep water. And what lay beneath them was older and less interested in human categories of possible and impossible. Ghost ranged ahead, white against white, visible only by movement. John tracked the dire wolf through sound and scent rather than sight, the soft compression of paws on packed snow, the warm animal smell cutting through the pine-cold air, the absence of tension in Ghost's movement that meant the immediate perimeter was clear. He tracked 6 other things simultaneously: wind direction, temperature drop rate, the distant tree-lean's stillness, the breathing patterns of his 6 brothers behind him, the faint charcoal smell of an old fire somewhere northeast that was days dead, and something else, something that had no smell. That was the thing about the White Walkers that no one who hadn't been close to them could understand, and that John had been trying to articulate to Mormont since his first ranging and failing. Because human language didn't have the right architecture for it. They didn't smell of death. Death smelled of iron and rot, and the sweet, sick decomposition that the body performed as it returned to Earth, familiar, biological, almost honest in its directness. The White Walkers smelled of nothing, a specific act of nothing, the olfactory equivalent of a sound that canceled other sounds, an absence so complete it registered as a presence. He stopped the party with a raised fist. Gren halted immediately, the veterans a half-second behind him. PYP's hand went to his sword. Sam, to his credit, stopped and was quietly terrified rather than noisily terrified, which John had come to appreciate as one of his better qualities. How many? Gren murmured. John held up 2 fingers, then reconsidered. 3. He couldn't see them yet. The tree line ahead was dense spruce, snow-laden, perfectly still in the windless morning. But the act of nothing was in 3 locations across a 200-foot spread, and it was moving with the patient, unhurried quality of things that had no relationship with urgency, because they had no relationship with time. Then the first one stepped out of the trees. John had seen the dead before, whites, reanimated with the Night King's power, their blue eyes carrying the cold light of borrowed animation. He had studied accounts in Sam's transcribed texts with the focused attention of someone who believed in knowing an enemy's mechanics before meeting them professionally. He thought he had constructed an adequate internal model of what a White Walker was. He had not. The figure that emerged from the spruce shadows was tall and thin in the specific way of something that had been reduced to its essential structure, its face a geometric arrangement of sharp angles, beneath armor that seemed grown rather than forged, crystalline and blue-white, catching the dawn light and doing something wrong with it. Its eyes were blue fire, not the metaphorical blue fire of poetic description, actual cold combustion, a color that had no ghost ranged ahead, white against white, visible only by movement. John tracked the dire wolf through sound and scent rather than sight, the soft compression of paws on packed snow, the warm animal smell cutting through the pine-cold air, the absence of tension in Ghost's movement that meant the immediate perimeter was clear. He tracked 6 other things simultaneously: wind direction, temperature drop rate, the distant tree-lean's stillness, the breathing patterns of his 6 brothers behind him, the faint charcoal smell of an old fire somewhere northeast that was days dead, and something else, something that had no smell. That was the thing about the White Walkers that no one who hadn't been close to them could understand, and that John had been trying to articulate to Mormont since his first ranging and failing. Because human language didn't have the right architecture for it. They didn't smell of death. Death smelled of iron and rot, and the sweet, sick decomposition that the body performed as it returned to Earth, familiar, biological, almost honest in its directness. The White Walkers smelled of nothing, a specific act of nothing, the olfactory equivalent of a sound that canceled other sounds, an absence so complete it registered as a presence. He stopped the party with a raised fist. Gren halted immediately, the veterans a half-second behind him. PYP's hand went to his sword. Sam, to his credit, stopped and was quietly terrified rather than noisily terrified, which John had come to appreciate as one of his better qualities. How many? Gren murmured. John held up 2 fingers, then reconsidered. 3. He couldn't see them yet. The tree line ahead was dense spruce, snow-laden, perfectly still in the windless morning. But the act of nothing was in 3 locations across a 200-foot spread, and it was moving with the patient, unhurried quality of things that had no relationship with urgency, because they had no relationship with time. Then the first one stepped out of the trees. John had seen the dead before, whites, reanimated with the Night King's power, their blue eyes carrying the cold light of borrowed animation. He had studied accounts in Sam's transcribed texts with the focused attention of someone who believed in knowing an enemy's mechanics before meeting them professionally. He thought he had constructed an adequate internal model of what a White Walker was. He had not. The figure that emerged from the spruce shadows was tall and thin in the specific way of something that had been reduced to its essential structure. Its face a geometric arrangement of sharp angles, beneath armor that seemed grown rather than forged, crystalline and blue-white, catching the dawn light and doing something wrong with it. Its eyes were blue fire, not the metaphorical blue fire of poetic description, actual cold combustion, a color that had no business existing in an iris, radiating a light that made the snow around it dim rather than brighten. It looked at John, not at the ranging party, at John specifically, with a focused attention that suggested it had already processed and dismissed the 6 brothers as contextual detail and arrived at John as the relevant variable. John felt the attention land on him with a physical weight, felt his demon blood respond to it with something that was not quite fear and not quite recognition, and was deeply, profoundly uncomfortable, in the way that things are uncomfortable when two very old things encounter each other across a very old divide. His eyes went red, not the grief red of Ned's death, uncontrolled and consuming. This was different. The demon's combat state, precise and cold. The red a targeting mechanism rather than an emotional failure. The ancient warriors, blood reading the threat and allocating resources with a clarity that the rational Jon Snow could observe from somewhere slightly behind his own eyes and appreciate, even as it frightened him. Longclaw came out of its scabbard. The White Walker raised what it carried, a weapon of the same crystalline material as its armor, spear-shaped, radiating that active nothing in concentrated form, and moved. It moved the way the cold moved, without apparent effort, covering ground as if the ground's opinion on the matter was irrelevant. John moved to meet it. The collision was nothing like fighting men. Men had weight, momentum, the biological telegraph of muscle loading before a strike that John's senses read like words on a page. The White Walker had geometry, angles of attack that followed no human combat logic, the weapon moving through trajectories that seemed to ignore the constraints of a body behind it. John took the first exchange by instinct rather than skill, the demon's reflexes operating faster than thought, claws intercepting the crystalline spear at an angle that turned the strike rather than blocked it, the impact sending cold up his arm that was more than temperature. Longclaw came across in a horizontal arc. The force behind it was not entirely John's own. The wind scar, the demon blade's capacity when his blood ran hot enough, released in a compressed burst rather than a full wave, a directed pressure that caught the White Walker in the chest and drove it backward 15 feet through the packed snow. It did not fall. It recalibrated, the blue fire eyes reassessing, with the unhurried patience of something that didn't experience surprise, only updated information. The second walker emerged from the trees to John's left. The third came from the right. Dragonglass, John said, his voice carrying the flat operational calm of demon combat state. Everyone. Now. Sam already had his blade out, hands shaking with a courage that was more impressive for being clearly terrified. Gren and the veterans formed up with the trained efficiency of men who had practiced this without ever believing they'd need it. PYP's face had gone the color of old bone. What followed was not a battle in any sense that a maester would record with pride. It was a survival exercise at close quarters against 3 entities that did not tire, did not fear, and did not negotiate. John held the center, claws and Longclaw working in combination, the demon's speed making him the only member of the party capable of matching the walkers' geometric efficiency, while the brothers worked the flanks with Dragonglass, finding the vulnerability that the old texts promised and that Sam had verified through 3 Preundal scrolls and a desperate faith in scholarship. The third walker fell to Gren's Dragonglass blade, while John held the first two's attention with the absolute, focused aggression of a demon who had found something to be angry at that was not grief, and was not shame, and did not require him to suppress anything at all. When it was over, the treeline was still. The act of nothing had lifted. The world smelled again, pine and snow and the shaky adrenaline-sharp sweat of 6 men who had done something the watch had no official protocol for. John stood in the center of the disturbed snow, red fading from his eyes, and looked north. The treeline gave nothing back. But somewhere in the demons, ancient architecture of accumulated lives and carried knowledge, something recognized, what the White Walker's gaze had communicated in that first moment of contact, before the fighting, before the cold and the crystalline weapons and the geometric violence. It had looked at him not as prey, not as obstacle. As intelligence arrived at the correct conclusion, Littlefinger's ravens had a particular quality that John had come to recognize. The way he recognized the smell of spoiled meat. Superficially presentable, fundamentally wrong beneath the surface. The letter that arrived at Castle Black 3 weeks after the ranging bore the Mockingbird seal and was addressed not to the Lord Commander, but to Jon Snow directly, which was itself a message about what Peter Baelish wanted Jon to understand regarding his intelligence network's reach. A man who could address a raven to a specific Night's Watch recruit was a man telling you that he knew exactly where you were and had known for some time and found your attempts at obscurity charming. John read it twice. Then he gave it to Sam, because Sam's instinct for subtext was better than his own, and because 2 sets of eyes on a schemer's letter were always worth more than one. Sam read it once and looked up with the expression he wore when something in a text disturbed him more than he wanted to admit. He's offering legitimization. Keep reading. John, he's offering you the Stark name. Official. Through royal decree. Sam set the letter on the table with the careful precision of someone putting down something that might bite. He says he has Joffrey's ear. That with the right. He calls it arrangement. He can have you declared Jon Stark, trueborn son of Eddard Stark, with a claim to Winterfell. He paused. Which is currently occupied by Theon Greyjoy, apparently. Theon took Winterfell. So the letter implies. Sam's voice carried the particular grief of someone processing bad news about a place he'd never been, but had heard described often enough to mourn. He says you're the only Stark with the, he writes, unique capacity to retake it. He says the North would rally to a Stark name attached to. Sam glanced up. He writes, your particular qualities. Which is an interesting way to describe what you are. John stood at the narrow window of the room Mormont had given him, looking north. The wall was doing its groaning thing, a sound he no longer consciously registered except when he was trying to think, at which point it became the world's largest and most geological reminder that whatever political theater was happening south of it was a secondary concern at best. He watched me my entire life, John said. Since King Robert's visit at least. Probably before. He thought about Littlefinger's eyes at the Winterfell feast, that particular quality of a man encountering an asset he hadn't budgeted for. He wants leverage over something he can't control. Legitimization would give him a claim on my loyalty. I'd owe him the name. In Westerosi custom that's a debt, Sam said. He'd own the debt. And through the debt, some portion of whatever you can do. He hesitated. He doesn't know about the White Walkers. What you encountered beyond the wall. This letter was written before your ranging. No, he knows. John turned from the window. The letter arrived 23 days after the ranging. A raven from King's Landing takes 12 days at best, which means he sent it 5 days after we came back through the gate, which means he had someone at Castle Black reporting to him within 48 hours of our return. He let that sit. He knows. He just doesn't care, which is worse. Sam was quiet for a moment with the look he got when he was building an argument from available pieces. If you refuse, he'll find another angle. Littlefinger doesn't make one-move plays. John picked up the letter, looked at the Mockingbird seal one more time, and set it in the brazier. The flame took it with the cheerful indifference of fire consuming everything equally. What he doesn't know, what he can't know from a spy's report, is what the White Walker looked at me like. What do you mean? John considered how to explain what he had not yet fully explained to Mormont. What he had spent 3 weeks turning over in the part of his mind that processed threat at the demon's level of instinct rather than the human's level of analysis. The Night's Watch had a vocabulary. 4 White Walkers built from ranger accounts and ancient texts, and the accumulated terror of men who had encountered them and survived long enough to describe the experience. That vocabulary covered their appearance, their weapons, their capacity to reanimate the dead, their weakness to dragonglass and Valyrian steel. It did not cover what Jon had felt in the moment the first. Walker's blue fire eyes fixed on him specifically. It recognized something, he said finally. Not me. Not Jon Snow. Not a Night's Watch Ranger with unusual ears. He looked at his clawed hands. At the demon's inheritance laid across his own knuckles. It recognized what I carry. The half-demon blood. The soul in me that's older than the wall. He closed his fingers slowly, and it adjusted its strategy. Sam had gone very still. Adjusted how? The three of them were positioned for a standard ranging party kill. Efficient geometry, cut off retreat. Eliminate the group before they can signal back. Leave nothing that flies a raven. South. Jon's voice was flat, with the demon's combat recall. Precise and unemotional. The moment the first one saw me, they stopped moving into position and started moving into a different position. One that was about containing a specific target, rather than eliminating a group. He looked at Sam. They tried to take me. Not kill me. Take me. The silence in the room had a quality that was distinct from ordinary silence. The Night King, Sam said carefully, wants to know what I am. Jon nodded. Which means he doesn't know? Which means my demon blood is something outside his existing knowledge. And something outside the Night King's existing knowledge is either a weapon or a threat. And his reaction suggests he hasn't decided which. He paused. Which is the same calculation Cersei made. The same one Littlefinger is making from King's Landing. The same one Melisandre made from Dragonstone. Everyone wants to know what you are. Everyone wants to own what I am. Jon moved to his armor. Began the mechanical process of checking straps and buckles that his hands did automatically when his mind needed to work without interruption. Littlefinger's offer is the cleanest version of it. At least he admits it's a transaction. He paused with a buckle. Cersei just sends assassins. That's almost more honest. Sam sat up straighter. Cersei has sent two since I took the black. Jon said it without particular emphasis. The first was a recruit from King's Landing, arrived a month after us. His scent was wrong from the first day, wrong food, wrong fear sweat. The particular smell of someone performing a role rather than living one. He left before anything became necessary. He returned to the buckle. The second was more professional. Arrived with a supply wagon. Made it to within 40 feet before Ghost found him. Sam processed this with the expression of a man updating his threat assessment and finding the result alarming. You didn't tell Mormont. I told Ghost. Jon glanced at the dire wolf in the corner, who opened one red eye and closed it again with the serene disinterest of an animal that had already handled the relevant problems. Mormont has enough to manage without adding Lannister political assassination to his operational concerns. The Watch's problem is north. Everything south of the wall is noise. Even Robb, Sam said quietly. Jon's hand stopped on the buckle. The king in the north, Robb's banner raised. The Stark cause reconstructed. From the rubble of Ned's execution. With the young wolf's military genius and the North's furious loyalty. Jon had heard it through ravens. Through recruits arriving from the south with news embedded in their fear and anger. Through the general atmospheric pressure of a continent at war with itself. Robb was fighting. Robb was winning. Robb was doing all the right things in all the right ways. Which in Westeros was a description with a specific and terrible trajectory. Robb is not noise, Jon said. But Robb is also not asking for my help. He might be soon. Jon looked north through the narrow window at the wall and beyond it at the gray sky, pressing down on whatever the Night King was building in the endless cold. The ranging had changed his understanding of the timeline. The White Walker's adjustment of tactics, the attempt to capture rather than kill, meant the Night King had registered him as a variable. Variables were eliminated or controlled. The Night King would not wait indefinitely to do one or the other. Right back to Littlefinger, Jon said. Sam looked surprised. Tell him I'm considering the offer. Jon's voice carried no inflection that would tell a listener whether this was truth or tactic. Tell him I have conditions. Tell him the conditions require a face-to-face meeting. He paused. And tell him the meeting will have to wait, because I have more pressing concerns than a name. Sam picked up his quill with the expression of a man who understood he was participating in something that would either be very clever or very dangerous, and had accepted that with Jon Snow these categories were not mutually exclusive. And the pressing concerns? Sam asked. John buckled the last strap. The Night King knows I exist, he said. Which means, I need to know everything about him before he decides what to do about that. The assault came at the third hour past midnight, which John had been expecting for 11 days. He had smelled the army's advance. Before any sentry reported movement, the active, nothing of White Walkers multiplied, beyond the 3 he had encountered on the ranging. A wall of cold absence pressing south through the darkness with the patient inevitability of a tide that had decided the shores. Opinion was irrelevant. He had tracked it nightly from the wall's top, his demon senses reading the distance and direction and approximate scale of what was coming with a precision that had no human equivalent, and that he had been reporting to Mormont in careful, measured terms designed to convey urgency without producing the specific flavor of panic. That made men useless. Mormont had believed him. That mattered more than John could easily articulate. He had spent 11 days preparing Castle Black with the resources available to a garrison of 112 brothers, which was not many resources, but which John had organized with the tactical instinct of a demon's accumulated military memory, pressing up through the floor of his conscious mind, unbidden and useful. Dragonglass distributed. Torches doubled on the southern face, the Whites. Weakness to fire was the Watch's primary defensive advantage, and John intended to use every yard of it. Brothers positioned by demonstrated capability rather than seniority, which had produced 2 arguments, and 1 genuine confrontation that John had resolved by putting his clawed hand flat on a veteran's chest and holding his gaze until the veteran decided that seniority was a flexible concept. Sam had been assigned to Maester Eamon's tower with specific instructions. Keep the old Maester safe, keep the ravens ready, and if the wall was breached, send every bird south simultaneously with the same message. The long night has begun. Dragonglass and Valyrian steel. The wall is not enough. John stood on the wall's top when they came. The army of the dead moved out of the tree leans. Darkness like a tide withdrawing to reveal what the ocean floor had always contained, thousands of whites in the gray-blue light of a moonless night, their blue eyes providing their own cold illumination, the sheer scale of them making the darkness seem to have texture and weight. Behind them, at a distance that maintained command position, 3 White Walkers. And behind those 3, further back, a presence that John's demon senses registered not as a smell or a sound but as a pressure, the active nothing concentrated to its source. The Night King's awareness pressing south like a hand against glass. Looking for him specifically, John felt it land on him across the distance the way Melisandre's fire had leaned toward him. A recognition, a targeting. The Night King's ancient intelligence locating the variable it had flagged 11 days ago on arranging and updating its tactical disposition accordingly. John felt the attention and stood in it without moving, because moving would tell the Night King something, and stillness told him nothing. And in the absence of dragonglass arrows and Valyrian steel and a dragon that John did not have, information management was the only currency he could trade in. Gates, John said. The order went down the line. Castle Black's gate, the tunnel through the wall, sealed with the grinding authority of 10,000 tons of ice and the Watch's ancient locking mechanism. A sound like the world's largest key turning in the world's oldest lock. The Whites hit the wall's base. They did not climb immediately. They assembled, packing against the ice with the mindless, coordinated patience of things that had no individual investment in survival. Their collective movement governed entirely by the Night Kings will pressing through them like current through water. John watched them pack and felt his demon blood reading the geometry of the assault the way it had read the 3 walkers on the ranging, not individual combat logic, but something larger. A tactical intelligence operating through 10,000 bodies simultaneously. The climbing started at the eastern edge first. A diversion. Western gate, John said quietly to Grin. Take 12 men. They're coming over the west side while we watch the east. Go. Grin went without question, which was one of the things John valued most about him. The first wave crested the eastern wall 17 minutes later. 40 Whites over the ice in a section between 2 torch positions. The gap John had identified as the defensive line's weakest point and had been unable to adequately reinforce with the garrison's numbers. They came over silent and blue-eyed and immediately purposeful, moving toward the nearest brothers, with the direct efficiency of things that did not plan because their plan was already determined. John dropped from the wall's walkway to the yard below. The fall was 30 feet. He landed in a crouch that cracked the frozen yard beneath him and came up already moving, Longclaw clearing its scabbard in the same motion. The demon's combat state taking his eyes to red with a completeness that this time he did not fight. This was what it was for. This was the ancient warrior's blood reading a battlefield and making itself available without conditions or apologies. Ghost hit the white line from the left flank. A half-second after John hit it from the center. The direwolf was extraordinary in ways John had never seen fully expressed before. Ghost jaws finding the cold dead throats and tearing with an efficiency that suggested the wolf's instincts had always known what whites were even before John had. The white fur making him nearly invisible in the torchlit chaos. His movement creating the kind of unpredictable disruption that the whites coordinated. Logic struggled to account for where John fought with the precision of a half-demon who had trained every day of his life. Ghost fought with the clean, terrible honesty of an apex predator who had found appropriate prey. Iron Reaver Soul Stealer. The claws came out alongside Longclaw, John's left hand working in combination with the sword. The demon's strike pattern emerging fully for the first time in a real engagement. A combination his body apparently remembered from lives he had no conscious access to. The claws shredded through dead flesh and dead bone with an efficiency that would have been grotesque if there had been time to register it as such. There was not. The whites kept coming over the eastern wall with the patient arithmetic of a force that understood attrition, and John did not have the numbers to match it. He needed something bigger. The wind scar had released in compressed bursts on the ranging, controlled, directional, minimal. He had never attempted full deployment. The demon's blood carried the memory of it. The way muscle carries the memory of a movement performed 10,000 times. Theoretical familiarity, without practical confirmation, which in a combat situation was the most dangerous kind of knowledge to rely on. He relied on it anyway. John planted his feet in Castle Black's frozen yard, put both hands on Longclaw's hilt, and let the demon's blood rise without the lid he had kept on it every day of his life. Not the red-eyed grief of Ned's death, not the targeted precision of the ranging's combat state, the full thing, the ancient thing, the half-demon warrior's power running through Inuyasha's reincarnated soul without apology or suppression or the careful management of a boy who had spent 16 years making himself smaller than he was. His eyes went crimson. Longclaw's blade caught the light and did something to it that blades were not supposed to do. The steel seeming to breathe, to carry its own luminescence. The demon's power running through the Valyrian metal with a resonance that made the sword ring at a frequency below hearing, but above feeling. The brothers nearest him stepped back instinctively. The animal awareness of men in proximity to something there. Instincts correctly identified as categorically different from anything they had encountered before. The wind scar released. The force wave came off. Longclaw's blade in a cascading arc that crossed the eastern yard in a fraction of a second and hit the white mass with a sound like the world clearing its throat. 40 dead men came apart. Not messily, cleanly. The force separating them from coherent form with an efficiency that was almost mechanical, scattering the component pieces across the yard and the walls. Base in the darkness beyond it in a radius. That left the eastern section, momentarily, completely clear. Silence. Then the western gate alarm. John was moving before the sound finished. The demon's speed carrying him across the yard at a pace that left his own footprints behind him in sequence rather than simultaneously. The crimson eyes tracking thread geometry through Castle Black's layout with a three-dimensional clarity that let him calculate arrival time, engagement angle, and defensive positioning in the same breath. Grin was holding the western gate with 11 brothers and a resolve that John could smell from 40 yards, the clean, sharp scent of men who had decided that this was the thing they would not let through regardless of what it cost them. The Night's Watch's oath made biological, through sheer collective stubbornness. The White Walker commanding the Western assault saw John coming. John watched it process his approach, the blue fire eyes registering the crimson ones. The crystalline weapon shifting from the gate assault to a new orientation. The Walker's geometric combat logic, recalculating around the variable. The Night King had flagged. It raised its spear. John raised Longclaw. The collision between them was different. From the ranging, not a survival exercise, but a genuine test of what the demon's blood was capable of when fully expressed, against the existential cold that the White Walkers embodied. The spear and the Valyrian blade met in a collision that produced a sound and a light that had no business occurring simultaneously. The act of nothing of the Walker's weapon meeting the demon's warmth in Longclaw's steel and a reaction that cracked the western gate's stone archway and sent both combatants sliding backward across the frozen ground. The Walker reassessed. John had already moved. The wind scar, smaller this time, surgical, caught the Walker in a concentrated burst that drove it into the gate's stone wall with enough force to crack the crystalline armor at its shoulder. Not enough to destroy it. Enough to tell it something. Enough to tell it that the variable the Night King had flagged was not containable with 3 Walkers and a white advance. The attack stopped. Not gradually, all at once. The White's ceasing movement, simultaneously with the mechanical coordination of a will withdrawing its current. The blue-eyed dead going still across. Castle Black's yard and walls and gate with the instant completeness of a candle extinguished. The 3 White Walkers melted back into the darkness with the patience of things that were adjusting a plan rather than abandoning one. John stood in the western gate's archway with crimson eyes fading to dark and Longclaw in his hand and 11 brothers behind him, breathing in the ragged, disbelieving rhythm of men who had survived something they did not have adequate language for. The yard was silent except for the wall, groaning, always groaning. Above in Maester Eamon's tower, John could hear Sam's quill moving, scratch of it carrying through stone and cold air to the demon's ears with perfect clarity. The ravens already loaded, the message already written, the old blind Maester dictating in his thin, ancient voice the words that would fly south to courts and castles that were not ready to receive them. John looked north through the open gate into the darkness where the army of the dead had withdrawn. The Night King's pressure had lifted, but it had not gone. It had relocated, pulled back to a distance that said not tonight, without saying never. The patience of something ancient, enough to treat tactical retreat as a form of communication. The message was clear enough. Jon Snow had been seen. Jon Snow had been tested. And the Night King had learned exactly what he needed to learn about what Inuyasha's reincarnated soul was capable of when it stopped apologizing for itself. The next engagement would be designed accordingly. The ravens arrived in King's Landing, Dragonstone, River Run, and the Eyrie within 4 days of each other, which was either remarkable coordination or the gods demonstrating a sense of dramatic timing that the maesters would have found theologically inconvenient. Sam had written 12 copies of the same message in his careful scholarly hand, each addressed to a different seat of power, each containing the same essential information stripped to its operational core. The army of the dead was real, the wall had been tested, dragonglass and Valyrian steel were the only effective weapons, and Castle Black had held because of a half-demon ranger whose existence most of the recipients were only now learning to process simultaneously with the news that the dead walked in numbers that made every living army's count look like a tavern brawl. The responses came back in a sequence that told John everything he needed to know about the character of the men and women receiving them. Stannis Baratheon's raven arrived first, which was entirely consistent with a man whose relationship with duty was so absolute it had calcified into something indistinguishable from compulsion. The letter was characteristically brief. Stannis had no patience for rhetorical cushioning and contained 3 things: an acknowledgement that the threat was real, a declaration that he would march for the wall with whatever forces he could extract from his Dragonstone garrison, and a single line regarding Jon specifically that Melisandre had clearly influenced in its phrasing. The Red Woman tells me the Lord of Lights. Fire burns in you through means she does not fully understand. Rolalares' purposes are not mine to question. I am coming north. No pleasantries. No political framing. Stannis in 4 sentences. Robb's Raven came second, and John held it for a long time before reading it. His brother's handwriting had always been better than his own, the neat, deliberate script of a boy who had taken his maester's lessons seriously while John had been more interested in what was happening outside the window. The letter was longer than Stannis's and carried, in its length, the weight of a young king trying to balance the genuine urgency of what he was reading against the political reality of what responding to it would cost him. Robb was fighting the Lannisters on 2 fronts. His supply lines were extended. His bannermen's loyalty, while fierce, was conditional on victories that justified the cost of following a king whose claim rested on regional declaration rather than established succession. Marching north meant abandoning the war he was winning for one that most of his lords didn't yet believe existed. The letter ended with a line that John read 3 times. I cannot come yet, but I am coming. Hold the wall, John. Hold it until I can. You were always the better fighter between us, and I need you to prove me right about that one more time. John folded it carefully and put it inside his armor, against his skin, where the warmth of his own body would keep it from freezing. Cersei's response was not a raven. He smelled the assassin 2 hours before she reached Castle Black's outer perimeter, a professional this time, genuinely skilled, carrying none of the telltale performance anxiety scent of the previous 2 attempts. This one smelled of absolute calm, which was itself the tell, because absolute calm in a person approaching Castle Black in the dark after a white assault was either the Night's Watch's most composed new recruit or someone who had made peace with their own death as a professional prerequisite. John was waiting at the perimeter when she arrived. She stopped when she saw him standing in the darkness, crimson eyes providing their own illumination, claws visible at his sides. The Queen's response, John said. The assassin, a woman, young, lysine by her coloring and the particular quality of her stillness, looked at him for a long moment with the professional assessment of someone recalculating odds in real time. You knew I was coming. I know everyone who comes within half a mile. He tilted his head. Cersei sent you instead of a raven because she doesn't believe the dead walk and doesn't care. She believes I'm a political problem that survived her first 2 attempts and requires a more qualified solution. The woman said nothing, which was confirmation. Go back, John said. Tell her the wall held. Tell her the half-demon bastard she's been trying to kill since Winterfell is still breathing and has more pressing concerns than her throne. He paused. Tell her the dead are coming south, and when they arrive at King's Landing's gates, she will wish she had sent a different kind of raven. The assassin looked at him for another long moment. Then she turned and walked back into the darkness with the unhurried professionalism of someone who had correctly assessed that the contract was not completable and had no emotional investment in pretending otherwise. John watched her go and then turned back toward Castle Black, where the more complicated problem was waiting. Melisandre had not left. She had remained at Castle Black through the assault and its aftermath with the focused intensity of a woman whose theological framework had been significantly restructured by watching John release the wind scar in the Western Yard, and who was processing the restructuring with the disciplined rigor of someone who could not afford to have a crisis of faith and therefore was having a very controlled, systematic deconstruction of everything she thought she knew instead. She had spent 3 days in the room Mormont had given her, emerging only for meals that she barely touched, and John could hear her praying. In the hours before dawn, not the confident invocations of Rolalares, chosen but the careful, questioning prayers of someone renegotiating the terms of their belief. He found her in the common hall on the 4th morning, sitting at a table with her hands wrapped around a cup she wasn't drinking from, looking at the fire in the hearth with an expression that mixed revelation with something very close to genuine fear. She spoke without looking up. The flames showed me something last night. John sat across from her. They showed me the Night King. Her voice was measured in the way that voices are, measured when the speaker is deciding how much of what they know to say. He was looking north, beyond the wall, beyond his army, into something I couldn't see clearly. She paused, and then the flames showed me you, standing at the wall's edge, looking back at him. She lifted her eyes. In 30 years of reading Lawlor's Fire, I have never seen two figures looking at each other across that distance. Prophecy shows heroes and battles and moments of divine intervention. It does not show correspondences. We recognized each other on the ranging, John said. His army's assault was partly tactical and partly informational. He was learning what I'm capable of. And now he knows. Now he knows what I can do. With a sword and a contained release. John looked at his hands, the claws, the demon's inheritance, the thing he had spent 16 years managing downward. He doesn't know the ceiling. Neither do I. Melisandre was quiet for a moment. The prince who was promised, she said carefully, was foretold to carry a burning sword. Lightbringer. Azor. Ahai's weapon reborn. She looked at Longclaw on the table between them. What you did to that blade in the western yard, the light it carried. I have read the Lightbringer prophecy in 4 languages, and in none of them does it specify that the burning must be Lawlor's fire. She said it as if the words cost her something. It specifies only that it must be real. John looked at the sword. You're saying Longclaw might be. I'm saying the flames are showing me something. My theology didn't have a column for. And I am adapting. She met his eyes with the directness that was the most honest thing about her. I came here to determine whether you were Lawlor's instrument or an obstacle to his purpose. I am leaving with the conclusion that those may not be the only two options. What's the third? That the Lord of Light and the old gods built something together without telling either of their priesthoods about it, she said, which would be theologically unprecedented, and exactly the kind of thing gods do when the alternative is the long night, consuming everything, including the argument about which God deserves credit. Mormont arrived before John could respond to that, which was probably merciful for everyone's theological composure. The Lord Commander moved through the hall, with the weighted urgency he reserved for news that required immediate action, rather than considered response, and set a raven's message on the table between them without preamble. From the Shadow Tower, he said. 3 hours old. John read it. The Night King had split his army. The primary force, the mass that had tested Castle Black, had turned west along the wall's northern face, moving toward the Shadow Tower with a deliberateness that suggested destination rather than patrol. A secondary force, smaller but containing what the Shadow Tower's ranger described as figures of ice that move, like lords rather than soldiers, had turned east toward Eastwatch by the sea. John set the message down. He's not trying to breach the wall, John said. He's looking for the weak points in both directions simultaneously. Castle Black held, so he's testing whether the wall's defensive capability is consistent along its length or whether we're the exception. He looked at Mormont. He's also separating his command element. The White Walkers going to Eastwatch aren't assault troops. They're observers. Observing what? Mormont said. Whether I'll split our force to respond. John stood. He wants to know if I'm making the tactical decisions here or if I'm following someone else's orders. He's probing command structure. Mormont looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a man whose operational reality had shifted significantly since the morning, and who was processing the shift with the admirable northern practicality of someone who prioritized adaptation over shock. And are you? He said, making the tactical decisions. John picked up Longclaw. I'm a steward who led one ranging and survived an assault, he said. I make suggestions. You command. Then I'm commanding you to tell me your suggestion. Don't split. Hold Castle Black. Send ravens to Shadow Tower and Eastwatch, telling them to hold and not engage. The White Walkers. Directly, Dragonglass defense only, no. Ranging, no pursuit. He paused. And send a raven to Stannis. Tell him to bring every ship he has to Eastwatch. Not to fight, to be seen. He looked north through the hall's narrow window. The Night King is learning my decision-making. I need him to learn that I have resources he hasn't accounted for. Stannis' fleet as a bluff. As information management. John met the Lord Commander's eyes. The same thing he's doing to us. Mormont considered this for 3 seconds, which was how long the old bear needed to evaluate a sound tactical argument and decide it was sound. Write the ravens, he said, and left. Melisandre had watched this exchange with the focused attention of someone filing every Detail for later theological consideration. She stood as John moved to follow Mormont, and said quietly, "He is going to come himself eventually. The Night King, not his army. Him." John stopped. "The flames show it," she said. "Not when, not where, but the correspondence. You described two figures, looking at each other. Across distance, that is not a general and his enemy. That is something more specific." She held his gaze. "Be ready for what it means to face something that ancient with everything you are. Not the managed version. Not the hooded, clawed-filed, suppressed version." Her voice carried genuine weight. "The thing your father was afraid of and loved anyway." John stood in the doorway of the common hall with the wall groaning. Outside and the ravens, waiting to be written and Rob's letter warm against his chest and his father's gray eyes somewhere in his memory holding his with the steadiness of a man who had called what John carried God made and meant it. "You are of my blood in every way that matters." He walked out into the cold. Stannis Baratheon arrived at Eastwatch by the Sea on a morning that felt like the world holding its breath. His fleet came out of the gray dawn in tight formation. 30 ships flying the burning heart of House Baratheon, their hulls dark against the pewter sea, moving with the disciplined precision of a navy, commanded by a man who believed that sloppiness in formation was a moral failing, rather than a tactical one. John watched them from Eastwatch's battlements, with his right ear tracking the fleet's approach and his left ear tracking the White Walker observers that had been maintaining their position 2 miles north of the wall's eastern end for 6 days. The walkers had not moved since taking position. They had not attacked. They had simply watched, with the patient intelligence of a command element gathering information, their presence a constant pressure against John's demon senses like a hand pressed against glass that had not yet decided whether to push through. When Stannis's flagship cleared the headland and the burning heart banner became visible from the wall's top, the White Walkers moved, not toward Eastwatch, away from it, a withdrawal that covered ground with the fluid, unhurried efficiency of things that had obtained what they came for and had no reason to remain. John tracked them north until their active nothing faded beyond his range, and then he turned to find Davos Seaworth standing beside him on the battlements with the expression of a man who had just watched something he couldn't explain move in a direction he was grateful for. "They were watching," Davos said. "They were counting." John looked at the fleet. 30 ships, 2,000 men, approximately, depending on how deep Stannis packed the hulls. He paused. "The Night King now knows that Castle Black has naval support and eastern reinforcement, which changes his calculus on Eastwatch as a secondary breach point." Davos studied him with the careful attention of a man who had served a demanding king long enough to recognize competence and distrust the form it arrived in. The ears, the claws, the red fading to dark, eyes of someone who had been running on demon combat alertness for 6 days. Davos took all of it in with the Onion Knight's characteristic refusal to pretend he hadn't seen what he'd seen. "You're younger than I expected," he said finally. "People keep being surprised by that." "The Lord Commander's ravens described you as," Davos paused, choosing his words with the diplomatic care of a man who had learned that how you said a thing mattered as much as what you said. Significant. Mormont is economical with language. He wrote 4 pages. Davos almost smiled. For Mormont, that's a declaration of love. Stannis came ashore an hour later, and the meeting between them happened in Eastwatch's great hall with Davos and Melisandre flanking the king, and John standing alone across the table in the way he had learned to stand when he wanted to communicate that he required no political architecture around him to feel secure. Stannis looked at him the way Stannis looked at everything, with the flat, exhaustive assessment of a man who had decided long ago that reality deserved his full attention regardless of whether he found it convenient. He looked at the ears, the claws, the general reality of Jon Snow. "You held the wall," Stannis said. "The wall held itself. I helped. Don't be modest. It's a waste of both our time." Stannis put his hands flat on the table. "Melisandre has briefed me on what she observed. The wind scar, she calls it, a translation from texts she found in the restricted archive that Sam Tarly apparently catalogued for her. A flicker of something crossed his face that might have been the ghost of dry Appreciation. A steward and a maester's son saving the realm's oldest defensive structure through scholarship. Westeros should be embarrassed. He looked at Jon directly. You are Ned Stark's bastard. In every way that matters. Something shifted in Stannis's expression at that, a small, involuntary thing. The response of a man who had loved Ned Stark in the rigid, undemonstrative way that Stannis loved anything, which was absolutely, and without the ability to say so. He was quiet for a moment. He should not have died the way he did, he said. It was the closest thing to an emotional statement Jon had ever heard attributed to Stannis Baratheon, and it landed with the weight of its rarity. No, Jon said. He shouldn't have. Melisandre spoke then. When Stannis's flagship cleared the headland and the burning heart banner became visible from the wall's top. The White Walkers moved, not toward Eastwatch, away from it, a withdrawal that covered ground with the fluid, unhurried efficiency of things that had obtained what they came for and had no reason to remain. Jon tracked them north until their active nothing faded beyond his range, and then he turned to find Davos Seaworth standing beside him on the battlements with the expression of a man who had just watched something he couldn't explain move in a direction he was grateful for. They were watching, Davos said. They were counting. Jon looked at the fleet. 30 ships, 2,000 men, approximately, depending on how deep Stannis packed the hulls. He paused. The Night King now knows that Castle Black has naval support and eastern reinforcement, which changes his calculus on Eastwatch as a secondary breach point. Davos studied him with the careful attention of a man who had served a demanding king long enough to recognize competence and distrust the form it arrived in. The ears, the claws, the red fading to dark, eyes of someone who had been running on demon combat alertness for 6 days. Davos took all of it in with the Onion Knight's characteristic refusal to pretend he hadn't seen what he'd seen. You're younger than I expected, he said finally. People keep being surprised by that. The Lord Commander's ravens described you as, Davos paused, choosing his words with the diplomatic care of a man who had learned that how you said a thing mattered as much as what you said. Significant. Mormont is economical with language. He wrote 4 pages. Davos almost smiled. For Mormont, that's a declaration of love. Stannis came ashore an hour later, and the meeting between them happened in Eastwatch's great hall with Davos and Melisandre flanking the king, and Jon standing alone across the table in the way he had learned to stand when he wanted to communicate that he required no political architecture around him to feel secure. Stannis looked at him, the way Stannis looked at everything, with the flat, exhaustive assessment of a man who had decided long ago that reality deserved his full attention regardless of whether he found it convenient. He looked at the ears, the claws, the general reality of Jon Snow. You held the wall, Stannis said. The wall held itself. I helped. Don't be modest. It's a waffle attention regardless of whether he found it convenient. He looked at the ears, the claws, the general reality of Jon Snow. You held the wall, Stannis said. The wall held itself. I helped. Don't be modest. It's a waste of both our time. Stannis put his hands flat on the table. Melisandre has briefed me on what she observed. The wind scar, she calls it, a translation from texts she found in the restricted archive that Sam Tarly apparently cataloged for her. A flicker of something crossed his face that might have been the ghost of dry appreciation. A steward and a maester's son saving the realm's oldest defensive structure through scholarship. Westeros should be embarrassed. He looked at Jon directly. You are Ned Stark's bastard. In every way that matters. Something shifted in Stannis's expression at that, a small, involuntary thing. The response of a man who had loved Ned Stark in the rigid, undemonstrative way that Stannis loved anything, which was absolutely, and without the ability to say so. He was quiet for a moment. He should not have died the way he did, he said. It was the closest thing to an emotional statement Jon had ever heard attributed to Stannis Baratheon, and it landed with the weight of its rarity. No, Jon said. He shouldn't have. Melisandre spoke then, from her position at Stannis's right. Your Grace, tell him what the flames showed last night. Her position at Stannis's right. Your Grace, tell him what the flames showed last night. Stannis's jaw tightened, with the specific tension of a man who had made peace with his gods. Communication methods while retaining the right to find them inconvenient. The flames showed the Night King moving, he said. Not his army. Him. Directly. The Red Woman believes it will be soon. John had been expecting this since Melisandre's warning in the common hall. He had spent 6 days building his response to it in the part of his mind that the demons' tactical instinct occupied, running the engagement's variables through every available configuration. The Night King coming personally meant the informational phase was complete. It meant the Night King had assessed what John was capable of through proxy engagement and had arrived at a conclusion about what was required to address it. It meant John was being taken seriously in a way that felt nothing like an honor. When he comes, John said, it will not be at the wall. Stannis looked at him. The wall's magic is a constraint on him. Ancient wards, the same ones that required the whites to climb rather than pass through, the same ones that slow his direct influence south of the ice. John traced the tables, grain with one claw, thinking through the architecture of it. He won't engage me where the wards amplify whatever I'm carrying in my blood. He'll draw me out. He looked up. He'll attack something I'll come to. The silence in the hall had the quality of people understanding a thing they had hoped not to understand. Rob, John said quietly. Not a question. Ste of both our time. Stannis put his hands flat on the table. Melisandre has briefed me on what she observed. The wind scar, she calls it, a translation from texts she found in the restricted archive that Sam Tarly apparently cataloged for her. A flicker of something crossed his face that might have been the ghost of dry appreciation, a steward and a maester's son saving the realm's oldest defensive structure through scholarship. Westeros should be embarrassed. He looked at John directly. You are Ned Stark's bastard. In every way that matters. Something shifted in Stannis's expression at that, a small, involuntary thing, the response of a man who had loved Ned Stark in the rigid, undemonstrative way that Stannis loved anything, which was absolutely, and without the ability to say so. He was quiet for a moment. He should not have died the way he did, he said. It was the closest thing to an emotional statement John had ever heard attributed to Stannis Baratheon, and it landed with the weight of its rarity. No, John said. He shouldn't have. Melisandre spoke then, from her position at Stannis's right. Your Grace, tell him what the flames showed last night. Her position at Stannis's right. Your Grace, tell him what the flames showed last night. Stannis's jaw tightened, with the specific tension of a man who had made peace with his gods. Communication methods while retaining the right to find them inconvenient. The flames showed the Night King moving, he said. Not his army. Him. Directly. The Red Woman believes it will be soon. John had been expecting this since Melisandre's warning in the common hall. He had spent 6 days building his response to it in the part of his mind that the demons' tactical instinct occupied, running the engagement's variables through every available configuration. The Night King coming personally meant the informational phase was complete. It meant the Night King had assessed what John was capable of through proxy engagement and had arrived at a conclusion about what was required to address it. It meant John was being taken seriously in a way that felt nothing like an honor. When he comes, John said, it will not be at the wall. Stannis looked at him. The wall's magic is a constraint on him. Ancient wards, the same ones that required the whites to climb rather than pass through, the same ones that slow his direct influence south of the ice. John traced the tables, grain with one claw, thinking through the architecture of it. He won't engage me where the wards amplify whatever I'm carrying in my blood. He'll draw me out. He looked up. He'll attack something I'll come to. The silence in the hall had the quality of people understanding a thing they had hoped not to understand. Rob, John said quietly. Not a question. Davos leaned forward. The king in the north is at the twins, negotiating passage south with Walder Frey. He paused with the particular weight of a man who knew something. The room didn't yet. The ravens we've intercepted from Lannister birds suggest Tywin has been in correspondence with Frey for weeks. John was already standing. The Red Wedding, Melisandre said, and her voice carried the flat, terrible certainty of a woman reading something in flames that she could not change through announcement alone. It is already arranged. Tywin Lannister's design. Frey's hospitality, guessed right broken. Her red eyes found John's. The Night King does not need to attack. Robb Stark. Westeros will do it for him. And the grief. She stopped. John understood what she hadn't finished. The grief of losing Robb, the last piece of the family that had contained him. The brother who had never flinched at the ears or the claws. The young wolf who had written you were always the better fighter. Between us would produce the uncontrolled demon transformation that the Night King had been studying how to trigger since the ranging. Not a weapon John wielded. A weapon aimed at him. The Night King had watched the Castle Black assault and learned that John's grief cracked his control and had spent 6 days engineering the correct loss to crack it completely, at the correct moment, in the correct location south of the wall where John would be isolated from every defensive advantage. The Night King was not a monster operating on instinct. He was a general. John stood in Eastwatch's great hall with this understanding, settling into him with the cold clarity of something that changed the shape of everything going forward, and he felt his father's letter against his chest and Robb's letter beside it, and the weight of both pressed against his sternum like a hand held there. And he made the choice that Westeros made, necessary, and that Inuyasha's blood made possible. He would not go south. Not yet. Not the way the Night King wanted, running on grief and demon rage. Uncontrolled and isolated, and exactly as dangerous to the living as to the dead. He would go south the way his father had taught him to go anywhere, with his eyes open and his hood down, and the full reality of what he was walking through. The gate without apology. Send a raven to the twins, John said. His voice was steady with the effort of someone who had decided that steadiness was the only weapon the moment offered. Warn Robb. If Lannister birds have been intercepted, Lannister eyes are on the ravens, Davos said. Then warn him in a way they won't understand. John looked at Stannis. Your Grace, I need a horse, a rider I can trust, and whatever dragon glass you brought south on those ships. Stannis looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, with the flat, absolute quality of a man whose relationship with duty had just found its clearest expression in weeks, you'll have everything I can give you. The Night's Watch has my sword and my ships and my dragonglass. He paused. And whatever you are, whatever, the Red Woman and the old gods, and Ned Stark between them made of you. Westeros needs it south of the wall. John looked at Longclaw, at the Valyrian steel that had carried the demon's light in the western yard, at the blade that Mormont had given him with the quiet, gruff generosity of a man who recognized something worth equipping without fully understanding what he was equipping it for. Ghost pressed against his leg. Outside, the wall groaned, that constant, ancient sound, the world's oldest wound speaking in frequencies that only John's blood fully translated. Not warning, this time. Something else. Something that the Weirwood network carried through stone and ice from the god's wood at Winterfell, from the heart tree's carved face and its red sap tears, from the old gods who had woven Inuyasha's soul into a stark bastard and waited 16 years for the world to need what they had made, something that felt in the demon's deep architecture of accumulated lives and carried knowledge. Like permission, Jon Snow pulled on his cloak, left his hood down, and walked out into the cold with his wolf ears visible and his claws at his sides and the full, unmanaged reality of what he was, meeting the Westerosi morning without apology for the first time in his life. The wall groaned behind him. Westeros had been playing its game of thrones for 1,000 years, lords and kings and schemers and queens, moving pieces across a board they believed was the whole world. They had not accounted for the old gods moving a piece of their own. They had not accounted for a soul old enough to remember the long night's first coming, reborn into Ned Stark's bastard boy, carrying demon blood and a half-remembered warrior's knowledge and a grief deep enough to crack stone. The Night King had looked at Jon Snow across a ranging's distance and seen a variable. He had not yet seen what the variable became when it stopped hiding. In the Maester's records at the Citadel, in the Watch's logs at Castle Black, in the whispered accounts of brothers who had stood in the western yard and watched a bastard boy release something ancient and enormous from behind 16 years of careful suppression. The name Jon Snow was already acquiring the particular resonance that names acquire in Westeros when they become bigger than the person carrying them. Not a monster, not a god, not the Azor Ahai that Melisandre's theology required, or the political asset that Littlefinger's ledger demanded, or the problem that Cersei's paranoia had been trying to solve since Winterfell. Something older, something the old gods had spent a very long time making, in a world that was going to need it. The long night was coming. Jon Snow rode south with his wolf and his blade and his demon blood and the walls ancient, groaning at his back, and somewhere beyond the ice, the Night King turned his eternal attention southward and waited with the patience of something that had already survived one long night and knew, with absolute certainty, that this one would be different. The name written in ice and fire awaited its final proof. And winter, as it always did, came for everyone. The story of Jon Snow, bastard of Winterfell, ranger of the Night's Watch, reincarnation of a half-demon warrior older than the wall itself, had reached its first resting point, though resting was perhaps too peaceful a word for the precipice on which it ended. He had held Castle Black against the dead, turned away 3 attempts on his life, earned the conditional trust of a king who trusted nothing, and forced the Night King to treat a single man as a strategic problem worth personal attention. The wall still stood. Robb still breathed for now. The long night had tested its edges and found them harder than expected. But the Night King was a general, not a monster. And generals who lost the first engagement spent the second one correcting their mistakes. Jon rode south carrying demon blood and a dead man's letters, and the knowledge that the game of thrones and the war against darkness had finally, irrevocably become the same conflict. What Inuyasha's soul had been reborn to face was no longer approaching. It had arrived,